So, Jay, why don't you introduce yourself? I don't want to talk all over you. I've already introed myself.
Yeah, I'm Jay Jacobs, co-founder with Wade here at Cyentia, data nerd, and yeah.
Cool. Hey, thanks for joining. I really do appreciate it. The topic here today is a fun one. I want to give a little bit of background before we dive into the data. So for the last several years, I want to think this maybe stretches back to 2018. We have been working with Kenna Security, which is now Cisco. They partnered with us to begin a research series on vulnerability management. And if you're not familiar with Cyentia, this is not an advertising pitch, but we work with a lot of vendors, and we generally take data that they collect from offering whatever product or service they do. We analyze that data, and then our job is usually sharing that research with people like yourself that will hopefully put it into practice and improve things like vulnerability management remediation. I think this P2P series, or prioritization to prediction series, is possibly sort of the best example of what we at Cyentia like to do. In other words, we like to really dig in on a topic. We like to study it very thoroughly. We like to take a data-driven approach. We like to actually advance the state of art and practice on a particular domain. And we like having, a collaborative, mutually beneficial relationship with a security company like Kenna. And I think we've ticked all those boxes with this research. And they've been one of our longest running customers, so we've really had a chance to do a lot. And we'll share links for this so that you can find all of these volumes as we dig in. But there's some really good stuff here, some of which I had honestly forgotten about as we started putting this together. It's like, oh yeah, we did that too. Oh yeah, there's that. So been a lot of fun, and lots of good stuff that I hope you'll find even useful after this webinar. So I mentioned 8 volumes. That's a lot when you consider each one of these probably runs from 25 to 40 pages. We've got hundreds of pages. And one of the things I liked about this was it wasn't, you're all familiar with security reports. Sometimes they'll be annual basis, and you'll sort of do all the same things for the next year and just talk about how that year has changed. But this was different in the sense that every single volume tackles a different aspect of vulnerability remediation. There's some data points that are carried through, or we revisit them later, but each of these is kind of like all right, let's get started. Ooh, that was interesting. Let's pick up on that in the next research, and we dig deeper on that topic. And you'll see that as we go through here, that this is an unfolding kind of what caught our interest and what we would think is the next important thing to study as we move forward. And we actually learn stuff in this research series. So a lot of fun in that sense. 8 published volumes. There's also a 9th one coming out like within a matter of weeks. So we'll preview a little bit of this here. And then we don't have a link for it right now, but look for us, monitor Cyentia socials and all of that kind of stuff, and you'll get volume 9, which is due out imminently. Okay, without further ado, Volume 1. Volume 1 was obviously the first. We were digging into this notion of what does risk-based vulnerability management look like? How do we measure it? What are the things that are important? And I like this sort of modified quote from Bill Shakespeare, because you have this, hey, do we just give up on vulnerability management because there's too many vulnerabilities to contend with, or do we figure out a way to actually fight them off? And this was our attempt at doing that. So I'm gonna bring in Jay here because there's 2 measures that we need to briefly set some ground here, and that is coverage and efficiency. So Jay, you wanna give a recap there?
Yeah, absolutely. And these are actually precision and recall. And there's a great Wikipedia page describing what precision and recall is. These are not metrics that we made up, but What we did do is we renamed them because precision and recall are not very intuitive, whereas efficiency and coverage can at least apply to the remediation effort. You can think of efficiency as basically how efficient is my prioritization scheme. Out of the things that I'm prioritizing, how much of that is actually going to be exploited, or in this case, we labeled it high risk. And then the other one, coverage, is basically out of everything that we should have prioritized, what is the coverage of that? And these two concepts, precision recall, efficiency, and coverage, this is one of the earliest implementations that we did of this. And largely it was just CVSS, and we looked at, in this case, high risk, which I believe were things with exploit code published as well as evidence of exploitation activity, and we lumped that together. One of the interesting things on this one is that we also did this efficiency and coverage by chance. In other words, like if you just randomly selected CVEs at the time to remediate, to prioritize, you would have essentially about the same as doing CVSS 10 and above. If you selected the same number of CVEs as CVSS 10 and above would tell you, you're going to do about the same performance, just totally by chance. And this is back, I think, Wade, when was this? 2018?
18, yeah, 18. Maybe it published early 2019, but it was definitely done in 18.
Yeah, and there's about 100,000 CVEs, and I know I was just looking. Actually, I think we're 212 or something, 212,000 as of this morning.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's a lot of things out there. We've basically doubled in size since this first report.
And a little bit of context here. This first report was all about building a model or strategy for prioritizing remediation. And if you want to rewind back to 2018, we're going to talk about the exploit prediction scoring system in a little bit, but this was pre-EPSS. And a lot of organizations were using predominantly CVSS to prioritize, to figure out which vulnerabilities are worth my attention and deserve patching or other forms of remediation. And this chart, showed that, hey, if you go with, at the time, which was kind of industry standard recommendation, fix everything with a CVSS score of 7 or above, the coverage is telling you only fix about half the vulnerabilities out there that have known exploits associated with them. And the majority, about 30% of your work is effective in the sense that only 30% of the things that you fixed have exploits available. So you're fixing 70% of the stuff that probably could have been delayed, right? And you could have moved that effort over to fix more than just half of the ones that were exploited. So we wanted to create a model, and we got to get through this quickly. There's a lot of information here, but that line at the top is the first exploit prediction model that we presented at the very end of this report, where if you want to be highly efficient, you could achieve 35% coverage, but 80% efficiency. If you want a balanced approach, you can get over 60% coverage and 60% efficiency, or you can take a very risk-averse approach and maximize coverage. But this thing performed way better than CVSS and better than any other methods at the time. And this led to a paper, not a prioritization to prediction, that eventually led to the development of the exploit prediction scoring system. So definite thread here to those things that came about later. All right, got to move on, sorry. The volume 2, the title, Getting Real About Remediation. So the last one, right, ended with a model where we are trying to say, hey, here's a better way to handle the prioritization of your remediation efforts. This volume said, all right, well, what does that look like in reality? And at the time, we couldn't do a huge data pool for various reasons. I don't remember exactly why. So we sampled 12 organizations, and we studied a few years of what they were doing in terms of actually fixing these vulnerabilities. And that's what this was all about. Like, hey, let's measure some organizations and really see where they are. And going back to this notion that using whether or not a vulnerability has exploit code available or is actively exploited in the wild as a key signal for something that is high risk or should be remediated, we did this grid, and to this day, I really like it. We've done future versions or later versions of this, but if you split it down the vertically, on the right side, you've got about 2/3 of vulnerabilities that we observed within those 12 organizations. So that means a third were not in any of their environments, and so you kind of ignore them. And then if you split it horizontally, I think 20%-ish had known exploits and 80% did not. And so if you look in the upper left there, those are the ones that are actually vulnerabilities that affect production assets in these 12 sample organizations and also have exploits. And if you draw a little circle around that, that's what you want to fix first, right? And that really drove a lot of these efforts in terms of risk-based vulnerability management and trying to figure out, all right, that's critical to our remediation strategy, or those little red squares there. And we, not to say the rest are unimportant, but we can at least delay them until we get those done.
And I think it's worth calling out, Wade, that these charts are from a few years ago, but they're also, we've updated this several times and it still looks pretty much like this. I mean, like this hasn't shifted much at all. On the next slide, though, we took those 12 organizations and we mapped out specifically for that organization, their remediation strategy, what their efficiency and coverage looks like. And at a raw statistical level, the gray ones are essentially what the organizations are doing. Now, we also factored in the fact that patches do not just fix a single CVE. And so what we were doing is that we were penalizing, someone applying a patch that fixed like 10 CVEs on a Windows box, and only 9, or if one of them were exploited, the other 9 were counted against it and a lower efficiency score. And so what the blue does is it looks at the patch level and it says, if any of these are exploited or high risk, we should prioritize that patch. And you can see the efficiency jumped way up. And this is, I think, an interesting start to this. And this, of course, raised more questions than we had answers for. And that led into, of course, the third volume, where we get into actually looking at not just 12, but essentially, I think a few hundred in this one we're looking at here.
Yeah, 300 to 400 organizations, I think, on this. And we really wanted to focus on the speed of remediation, hence the title, Winning the Remediation Race. Because if the first two are, okay, are we getting all the vulnerabilities that we should, and how efficiently are we doing that? The next kind of question in my mind, or at least in our minds, was how quickly are these things being done? And this introduced the concept of survival analysis, which we continue to use heavily to this day, applied to remediation research, not just in this, but we applied it to software development with Veracode. We looked at external scans with another organization. So very useful approach, but Jay, quick summary of survival analysis in 10 seconds. No, I'm just kidding.
No, I mean, really quickly, one of the things this does is it accounts for those that are still open, right? So a lot of times when people say, what's the time to fix? They look at those that have been fixed and calculate an average or something like that. But this is actually looking at, it knows if something has been open for 6 months and it's still open at 6 months, we can factor that in and say, this one was not closed in the first 6 months. And so we know at least that much information that includes it.
Yeah, and this is across all the vulnerabilities, across all the affected assets. So it's not just, is this CVE fixed? It's, is that CVE fixed across all the assets that it affects, and not only one CVE, but all of them. So, and it started to develop concepts like the half-life of a vulnerability, shown here at about 100 days, right? It took 100 days to remediate half of the vulnerabilities across all of these environments. As you might guess, this is different for all kinds of different organizations and situations and that kind of thing, which we go into in that report. I would say the next big thing in this report is that there's just no way for organizations to keep up with the sheer volume. So this, on a monthly basis, took the average number of open vulnerabilities across all assets in the organization and the average number closed. And if you kind of look at that red line, you get about a 1 in 10, regardless of whether you have 100 vulnerabilities or a million vulnerabilities. It's about 1 in 10, meaning that on average, an organization fixes about 10% of the vulnerabilities in its environment. And that, of course, is not great news. It's a little depressing. But the blue dots, by the way, are all the different organizations in this particular study. But as this one goes on to say, the goal is not necessarily to fix all the vulnerabilities. You don't have to fix. And so is 10% remediation capacity good enough? And if you go back to that chart, we showed you the waffle plot with the little squares that are observed in the environment and exploited. If you can kind of focus there, it turns out 10% is good enough. And a majority of these organizations are able to keep up with high risk vulnerabilities or those that have known exploits. So if that's the measure of success, we did see some good news out of this, even though this seems to be not so great. All right, moving on. Told you it was the pithy P2P. So if you want the a detailed word synonym that starts with P, but if you want that P2P, they're all out there. All right, volume 4 was a fun one, and it was a different one because we actually combined survey results with observed metrics. So coming out of that volume 3, we noticed that certain organizations performed a whole lot better than others. And the question is why? What makes them faster at remediation? And so we got together and we thought of a bunch of questions that we could ask these organizations about their vulnerability management program. And then we wanted to correlate that with what we could measure about their performance to see what matters. We kind of took this approach, right? This is just an example question. We said, how mature is your program? Do you consider yourself in the top 10% or average, or where do you rank yourself? And 8% of them claimed to have a top 10% program, which actually is more fitting than I thought. I thought like 80% of them would say they're in the top 10%. But and then if you look at the bottom, that's actually how they measured. So I can't go into the details right now, but we created a remediation score, which takes into consideration their measured level of coverage, efficiency, their remediation speed, and several other things, and kind of rolls it into one, like how good are they? And those that said they were in the top 10% were in the, they were in the 73rd percentile of that score, and they fared better than those that are above average and better than those that were average. And in general, we saw some correlation between the survey results and the data results. Did not always see that, by the way, as we went through all the factors, but we ended up with something like this, where on the left-hand side, you have a bunch of the things that we asked about. Hey, are your assets hosted on-prem generally or off-prem? And what is your budget sufficient? And what kind of team structure do you have? And do you use CVSS, et cetera? And then across the top there are all the metrics that we were able to measure. And you see some pretty cool things like, hey, if you have an extremely complex remediation complexity, they said our process is really complex, then that seemed to work against, have a negative correlation with achieving high coverage, which is patching all the vulnerabilities that matter. Interestingly, if CVSS is your main prioritization tool, you had a negative hit to velocity. But there's lots of good things. The size of the circle is the strength of correlation. So lots of things had a measurable positive correlation with these outcomes that we wanted to measure. And again, this was kind of unique and kind of cool to be able to do this. Anything to add there, Jay? I took all the wind out of that one.
Nope. No, I think it was really interesting just getting that survey with the actual data. It was a unique one in this whole series that way.
Yeah. All right. Since I spoke last time, you do volume 5, which is in search of assets at risk.
This is where, for me, it really started to get fun. It was fun before, but this is where it really started to get fun. So
there we go.
in this one, we basically broke out the assets, and we're dealing with millions of assets here. And I think by this point, we're up to billions of vulnerabilities. And this is a plot that comes back into my head quite often. So if somebody says, hey, I've got a router, are these fast at being patched? And the answer is not really. So what we did is we grabbed the vulnerability scan data and we trusted what the vulnerability scanners were estimating the operating system to be, the fingerprinting that they were doing. And anybody who's worked in that space knows that sometimes that's a little challenging. And so we did some other things trying to get that just right, but about 40% didn't have good stuff in there. But out of the millions of assets, about 40% didn't have accurate fingerprinting. But these lines are showing remediation rates, and you can see like Microsoft and Mac OS X as far as the overall platform, and that includes, like on Microsoft, you're going to have a few other 100 vendors with software running on Microsoft, and that includes those as well. But you can see to get to 50%, like Mac was 70 days, Microsoft was 36 days to get to that half-life. And then Linux and Unix platforms, and then in the appliances were much, much slower. So just as a general rule, when you're thinking of like IoT devices, network devices, printers, things like that, they're going to fall into that appliances and devices. And generally those are slow. And so what you're going to see is those types of things are going to vary away from those lines, so, and Linux, amazingly different than Microsoft and Mac. And I'm sure that there are some that are well below this line, and probably a few Linux distributions, Unix distributions that are going to be slower than this line. So we put them all in this view, but this is something I always come back to. Just, someone says, hey, this IoT device, how fast is it? I'm like, well, it's probably pretty slow,
Yeah. And we did break this out, I believe. I think we had several different flavors of Linux and different versions of Windows. So we did split these out and do curves for dedicated to each category.
Yeah. And question real quick though, there was a question from Matt Rosenquist about correlation between the vendor producing a patch and the time of remediation, and we don't know. We didn't have a lot of accurate patch release data. What we're looking at is when a vulnerability showed up in a vuln scanner, which is 0 on this plot, and how long from the time that the company knew about it until it was remediated. And there are other ways to go after a vulnerability than simply patching. And so we always talk about remediation. So it could be a workaround. And there are ways within the Kenna platform to say, I've done a workaround, I'm going to, this is taken care of, even though the vulnerability might technically still be there. So you could remediate it without patching and stuff like that.
Yeah. And just on that topic, I do think a lot of this is a combination of the vendor being quick to make patches available and making them easy to implement, and organizations jumping on it and either auto patching, which is often done in Mac and Windows, or not, how fast they can do a risk assessment or whatever to make sure that something bad isn't going to happen if they deploy that. So combination there. On this chart, we kind of brought it all together. There's those 4 main categories, and then the things that we were measuring. And I kind of like this one because it expands it. So what we were just looking at is the speed of remediation, which if you look at that vulnerability half-life point, that's the horizontal slice in this 3670, 254, 369. Is shown right here. So yes, by this measure, Microsoft has a much lower half-life than appliances and devices. But on the other hand, if you look at vulnerability density, Microsoft has a ton more vulnerabilities per asset than appliances and devices. And even that is the same with high risk density. In other words, the density of vulnerabilities that have known exploits. And if you kind of go all the way to the right, and look at the next net capacity, then that's kind of at the end of the day what proportion of high risk vulnerabilities are being remediated. Most of them in appliances and devices are, whereas there's a good chunk, about a third, that are not for Microsoft. So strengths and weaknesses across all of these categories, and through this, we started to see, hey, a vulnerability management program could kind of take these metrics as their key performance metrics, KPIs for their program, right? And you can tailor a strategy to even optimize each category and improve things overall.
Yep.
All right, volume 6.
We're so not going to make the time on this, but
yeah, sorry. Volume 6 is volume 5 was one of Jay's favorites. Volume 6 is one of my favorites. We actually got some external data from Fortinet about the exploitation of vulnerabilities in the wild across their sensor array around the world, and combined that with Kenna's remediation data across organizations. And we wanted to measure, hey, what is the attacker-defender divide or momentum or advantage, if you want to think about it like this. And there's a ton of stuff that we did in this to try to understand the life cycle of how things go down. A CVE is reserved, and then at some point in the future, that CVE is published and a patch becomes available and people start picking it up in their vuln scanners, and then exploit code may be developed and it may be exploited in the wild. But it doesn't always happen exactly in the order shown there at the top, which is the typical. That chart down at the bottom shows that, well, sometimes the patch is available at first, and sometimes the bottom one, it's exploited in the wild before the patch is ever available. And there's all kinds of variation around all of these things. And each vulnerability kind of has its own route, and we do a lot of analysis in this report around that. But one of the things where we end up here is trying to answer the question, who has the advantage? Do the defenders work faster than the attackers in remediating vulnerabilities across their assets, or do attackers work faster in exploiting all their targets? And these are the blue line and the red line that you see here. That blue curve is kind of the inverse of that survival curve that we've shown you a few times, saying, all right, once the patch is available, defenders go to work patching all their assets, and that percentage is percentage of assets. The red line is the same kind of thing, but it's detection of exploits in the wild as far as the total target population that ever recorded detection of an exploit targeting that vulnerability. So in the figure to the left, it looks like defenders have a healthy advantage when the patch is published before exploit code, right? That blue area is the time period in which defenders have the first mover advantage, or the advantage in terms of remediating assets over attackers. On the right is what it looks like when the exploit code is published before the patch is available. You can see attackers can start exploiting systems early, right, before defenders ever have a chance to start remediating. And then defenders get the patch and they start to work, and they have a tiny little area of advantage, and then attackers overtake. So it's a huge difference in the time that defenders have to work faster than attackers and stay ahead. So we found this to be super, super interesting, and that led us to investigate this further in volume 7. Jay, want to set up volume 7?
And even though volume 5 was the most fun, up by volume 5, volume 7 was the more fun than 5, I think, actually. But this sets up, we entered this after doing those curves and thinking, what is let's actually test this thing about releasing exploit code. And so at the beginning of volume 7, I don't think we have any plots for it, but we tested 3 hypotheses about releasing exploit code. And I'm trying to think of them off the top of my head. They made it easier to patch. We looked at that. They made it, and that was not the case. They made it easier to develop signatures, and that also was not the case. And then the last one was on the flip side, that it made it easier for attackers to exploit, and that was absolutely the case. We saw, 15x increase in the volume, and I can't remember how many different targets were actually compromised more when there was exploit code out there, had exploitation activity, I should say, not compromised. But so there was a huge thing in the beginning. And I think that was a really, really interesting finding to go down that path. I think there's more to do there.
We don't get to do actual hypothesis testing very often in security research. So that was cool. Yeah,
that was fun.
All right. So attacker defender, you saw those curves that we just did across all vulnerabilities from the prior volume. We wanted to look at that across different types of assets. Here we're showing you vendors, just to address the question of, does this notion of attacker defender momentum or advantage change based on the kind of software we're using? And it absolutely does. So notice top left, Google. If you think about Google, that's probably a lot of browsers and things of that nature, usually auto patched, and very healthy defender advantage over the attackers on that. Similar thing with Microsoft. Microsoft gets those patches out there quickly, and in general, defenders stay ahead of attackers. But if you look at Siemens, right, which is they manufacture a lot of industrial technology, which probably is a little bit harder to patch, and you can't just auto patch those things because they're supporting live production operations and other things like that. And you can see that this changes a lot depending on which software we're talking about. I find this fascinating, by the way, because this does give you a sense of, if you think about these deployed all across your environment, some areas you're going to be able to maintain defender advantage more readily than others, just by the inherent nature of how these things work, right? Regardless of how great your team is or anything like that. But I think this is really important concept, and kind of expanded here as we did a chart comparing rate of remediation for these. I think we may have used half-life or something to do this, and rate of exploitation. So, kind of where you wouldn't really want to be in this is way to the left, meaning very slow remediation, and way up. Upper left corner would be slow remediation, fast exploitation. And thankfully, nobody's like high up in that quadrant. Everywhere, everything is kind of different on this, which I think may give an indication of how some of these need to be addressed and thought of in terms of risk-based vulnerability management, right? These have different risk profiles and managed differently. And that kind of led us into volume 8. Jay, do you want to set this one up, or we like you said, we're running out of time. So
yeah, we're running out of time. So we just did this simulation that was really illuminating, and we started with EPSS score as perfect info. And if you guys remember that scatter plot that we had, that red line showing about 10% were actually able to fix about 10% of their vulnerabilities. We grabbed, we looked at that again, and I think it was about 14% again. And so the red dot here is the median, the about 14%, 50% of orgs were at 14% capacity. And then on the low end, I think it was like 6% capacity. On the high end, it was like 26% of their open vulnerabilities orgs were able to change. And so then, given this perfect information with EPSS and your ability, your capacity to remediate, we did these different strategies. Again, we did a random strategy. And so if you're doing a random strategy, you get, the red, yellow, and blue for low, medium, and high capacity. And those are all defined. You can see CVSS came in second place. And then if you just went after the easiest to remediate, the quickest, you saw sort of a big jump over CVSS. And even going off of Twitter, and this, I did a recent post looking at Twitter CVE mentions. This is straight off of CVE mentions. So like if you were able to use your capacity to remediate and you just counted mentions of CVE on Twitter when there isn't a backlash of a post on CVEs, you will see that that predictive capability is better than CVSS as far as going after things that matter. And then just straight prevalence, I think, was super interesting. And then exploit code, of course, if there's exploit code out there, so a huge jump in the importance of that particular variable. I think on the next slide, we get to the really, really important point.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point here that, again, we're talking about, like, as your team could improve your remediation capacity, you fix more vulns faster, and there's various ways to do that. Or you could do a better strategy, right? You have these two things, and they're not mutually exclusive, as you'll see in the next slide. But I think this is interesting because it shows that regardless of your capacity, how many vulns you can fix, certain strategies are going to outperform others, even if you're a low capacity org. And again, that's an important point. But the main point is you don't do either or, you do them both. And if you do them both well, you really start to unlock some improvements. So going from just a random strategy, and I think low capacity or moderate capacity, you can get a 29x improvement, and that's by reducing overall exploitability as measured by EPSS. We get into how we measured that in the volume. But if you have high capacity and you prioritize on exploit code, that's 29 times better at minimizing exploitability than just randomly doing stuff. And it's significantly better than using CVSS with high capacity. So these things matter. And again, this is why I love this topic, because it really starts to make a difference in how vulnerability management programs perform. Okay.
Yep.
If you gotta drop off, I get it. We did not make the 30-minute time goal for getting through 8 volumes, but I'm going to super quickly tell you what we're doing in volume 9 if you can hang on here for a bit. So as I mentioned, volume 9 of this prioritization to prediction series will publish in, I think, a couple weeks. It's early August is my understanding, or late July. And in that, going back to the notion of strategies, since we published 8, CISA has really put a lot of emphasis on the known exploited vulnerability catalog, right? And there's been a lot of, hey, how do we use this and what's it for? And that was our guiding question in this, okay? Is that a good strategy for guiding our remediation efforts? Where does it fit in with all the other stuff that we might be doing in terms of prioritizing remediation? This chart is just showing there's an increasing number of vulnerabilities added to the KEV, getting up close to 1,000 as of the end of last month, and I assume will continue to climb. I think it's interesting. This is kind of a version of that waffle plot that we showed you, where it's either not observed in the environment or observed and it has exploitation activity or doesn't. And we mentioned we've done this more recently. About 3.2% of all CVEs published to the MITRE CVE list have known exploits and were observed in some organizational environment across all the organizations we have. That's everything. But on the right, if you look exclusively at the KEV, that's 61% of those are observed and known to be exploited. And from that perspective, that's great, right? Like, yes, it is focusing on that quadrant that we should be remediating, right? But the question is, what's not there? Like, what are we missing? And Jay, you've done tons of these Venn diagrams. So you wanna talk through this one?
Yeah, and so with this research, Kev, is that I don't even know what color that is, like a greenish color, the small circle in the middle. And those are all of the CVEs on the KEV list. And the big gray circles, all the CVEs, all the published CVEs. And then the red circle represents all of the CVEs that we have observed exploitation activity for in this research. And you can see the overlap. So even though we're seeing like 60% of the CVEs on KEV had exploitation activity in this data, there was a huge part of this circle that did not appear on the KEV. And so you can think of this efficiency and coverage concept again. The efficiency is really good. 60% of things that KEV is telling you to fix, you should fix, definitely. But then the coverage is going to be rather low. I think it's a single-digit percent of CVEs being exploited is actually on the KEV. And so that's again, back to that efficiency and coverage. So they're really great ways to talk about your prioritization scheme.
So, that brings up, hey, how can the KEV fit into your risk-based vulnerability management strategy? Well, we're not going to answer that right here. Sorry. Hopefully you knew we wouldn't spill the beans, but we do get into it and we measure it against lots of other things, and you get to see exactly where KEV falls on that coverage and efficiency graph, and where other things that you could be using fall as well. And the discussion there is, all right, how can you use it? And hopefully there's good, useful advice for those that are asking yourselves that question. All right, we're going to wrap it up here. In case you're interested in what we're doing outside of P2P in terms of vulnerability management and remediation R&D, here's a couple things. We've mentioned EPSS, right? EPSS is a free, open model for predicting the probability that a vulnerability will be exploited in the wild. You can get it right there. You can download that information. Lots of organizations and security vendors are adopting EPSS, and it's got a lot of traction. Again, that is free, and Jay chairs the EPSS special interest group at FIRST. We, Cyentia, also have the Exploit Intelligence Service, which is meant to add some additional analytics around EPSS and things like that to support organizations that are more advanced and really want to implement EPSS and do some additional things with it. Since we are the developers of that, we have some good insights there. And then we're also tracking, because that knowing when things are exploit code is released and when it's exploited in the wild is super critical for prioritization. Tracking that across multiple sources, including some models to identify exploit code in GitHub repositories, which is the premier place to publish that nowadays, passing Metasploit and ExploitDB and other things that people monitor for that stuff. But that's a daily feed of that kind of information and our analysis to support your prioritization decisions. Find out more about that. And with that, thanks for the time. I mean, we got it in under 45 minutes for all of this, which I think is a goal for Q&A. And I know that some of our colleagues have been answering your questions as we go through. Closing comments or anything?
There was a question on the chat that I wanted to bring up, and Pip Wallace asked, why does the big red circle not make it on the KEV? And I can't fully answer on behalf of SysAKEV, but I know that they have slightly different goals, and I wrote that in the chat. But like they want to create a list that will bring federal agencies to action. And there's a concern, I think, that if they put 10,000 vulnerabilities on the KEV, that they would actually elicit a different response, that people would see that list. And I don't know if that's actually true. I think that would probably be something in my mind, that I wouldn't want to put 10,000 vulnerabilities on a list all at once. And I try to be picky. But also they have other requirements, like there must be a patch available. They want to be sure that the technology is actually deployed in a federal agency. They don't want to put things on there that people have to go try to find, and stuff like that. And so they just have different goals and different priorities and different data sources. I don't think they have this list of 10,000. Yeah, so really complex answer, but yeah.
We will make this available. So if you're subscribed to Cyentia newsletter, if you follow us on various socials, we'll let you know when this publishes to our YouTube channel. Carolyn, anything else you want to say in regard to that?
You threw her right on the spot. She wasn't quite ready.
I threw her on the spot. Sorry.
Yeah.
All right, y'all. Hey, appreciate your time. I know you're doing lots of important stuff. So reach out to us with questions and comments about this. We like hearing you. And if you have directions or thoughts for where we should take this research in the future, we're all ears. See ya.